My name is Brown Warren, and at 45, I thought I had everything a man could ask for. Just 3 months ago, my net worth hovered near $7 million. I owned a thriving plumbing supply company, a 6-bedroom colonial in Connecticut, and 2 kids away at college. But today, I'm here to tell you how losing all of it led me to something far greater, something that would change the very course of my life. Before I tell you my complete story, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story travels. When my ex-wife, Vanessa, and her slick lawyer boyfriend stripped me of everything I'd built, I thought my life was over. But sometimes, fate has a strange way of humbling you before it hands you back your strength. Pathetic, Brown, Vanessa had sneered that day in the courthouse hallway, Dennis Corbett's arm looped around her waist. 20 years of marriage and you never saw this coming? You're no businessman, you're a blind fool. Dennis smirked, straightening the cuff of his Italian suit. Nothing personal, Brown. Well, maybe a little. Their laughter bounced off the marble walls, sharp as knives twisting into my chest. I stood there in my only decent suit, watching the two of them walk away with everything that had taken me half my life to build, the business that started in my father's old garage, the home where my children had taken their first steps, and the savings account that held $6.7 million. Even custody of my twins, Mason and Sophie, 19 years old and in college, had gone to her. Sue me, Vanessa tossed over her shoulder, flashing that cruel smile I'd once loved. Oh wait, you can't. You're broke now. I'm untouchable. Dennis made sure of that. 3 months later, I was living in a cramped studio apartment that smelled like mildew and hopelessness. My last $1,000 sat in my checking account, and for the first time in decades, I had nowhere to be and no one to call. That's when I remembered something from long ago, a dusty old savings account my grandfather, Eugene Warren, had opened when I was born. It was supposed to have $50 in it, maybe enough for a meal or two if it still existed at all. But when the bank teller pulled up that account, her face went pale as chalk. She stammered, called her manager, and together they stared at the screen as if it had shown them a ghost. Mr. Warren, the manager whispered, his voice trembling, this account's been compounding since 1960. He slowly turned the monitor toward me. And what I saw made my knees buckle. The woman who thought she'd destroyed me, the man who believed he'd won, neither of them had the faintest idea of what was coming next. Because my grandfather, a factory worker who never earned more than $15,000 a year, had just reached out from beyond the grave to rescue his grandson in a way I never could have imagined. This is that story. And trust me, you're going to want to hear every word of what happened next. Before everything collapsed, I want you to understand who I was, because that's the only way you'll grasp how far I fell. Warren Plumbing Supply began in a rented garage in Newark back in 2004. I was 25, a young man with a business degree, a pregnant wife, and $12,000 my father had left me when he passed. Every morning before sunrise, I'd kiss Vanessa's growing belly, grab my thermos of coffee, and head out to the garage to sort inventory before my first customers arrived. Contractors knew me as the guy who always had what they needed, when they needed it, and for a fair price. You're going to work yourself to death, Vanessa used to say in those early years, rubbing my shoulders as I hunched over invoices and receipts at our kitchen table. The kids need a dad, not a ghost with a briefcase. Those kids, Mason and Sophie, came into this world on a cold November night, 2 tiny miracles that made me promise I'd give them everything I never had. My own childhood wasn't terrible, but money was always tight. My grandfather Eugene had worked at the Chrysler plant for 40 years. My father, Harold, had been a maintenance supervisor at the county hospital. Honest work, but never enough to sleep peacefully without worrying about bills. By the time Mason and Sophie hit middle school, my business had outgrown that old garage. I'd moved into a 15,000 square foot warehouse, hired 30 employees, including my brother, Tommy, who managed deliveries, and my cousin, Frank, who handled the commercial clients. Every Thursday, I'd meet Walter Drummond, my accountant, at Louie's Diner for breakfast. Brown, you're one of the few who made it, Walter used to say, tapping the financial reports between our plates of eggs and toast. Most businesses die in 5 years. You're going on 16, and growing 20% annually. And he was right. We'd landed a contract with Brennan Construction, one of the biggest commercial builders in the region, worth nearly $2 million a year. Between that and our retail accounts, our total revenue climbed to $8 million annually. I'd built something real. After taxes, investments, and careful saving, I'd accumulated that magic number, $6.7 million in liquid assets. Our house in Westchester County was everything Vanessa had dreamed of back when we were newlyweds scraping by. 6 bedrooms, 4 baths, a pool, and a kitchen she remodeled 3 times because it didn't feel modern enough. She quit her job as a dental hygienist once the twins started school, saying she wanted to focus on family and networking. The country club isn't about golf, Brown, she'd tell me with that polished smile. It's about influence. Connections. That's where deals happen. And she wasn't entirely wrong. I'd met a few clients through those events, though I rarely attended. I was always buried in work. Vanessa, on the other hand, attended every lunch, every gala, every fundraiser, dressed like money itself. It was around that time she started mentioning a name more often, Dennis Corbett, a lawyer she'd met through charity circles. Handles all the high-net-worth divorces in the state, she said casually over dinner one night. Made partner at 35. Impressive, right? I didn't think much of it then. I should have. My daily life ran like a machine, 5 a.m. to 8 p.m. shifts, paperwork Saturdays, emergency calls on Sundays. Mason was at Boston College, Sophie at NYU, two kids I loved more than life itself, though our connection had begun to fray. They'd call for tuition help, sometimes just to check in. But Vanessa handled most of the family communication. She was the bridge, or so I thought. Once, I overheard Sophie on the phone with a friend saying, "Dad loves that warehouse more than us." That cut deep, but I brushed it off. I told myself all the sacrifices were for them. Every late night, every missed recital, every postponed vacation, all of it was for their future. I thought I was building a legacy. I didn't know I was laying the foundation for my own destruction. The date March 14th is burned into my memory like a scar that never heals. It was our 22nd wedding anniversary, the one day I swore I wouldn't let business interfere. I left the warehouse early, roses on the passenger seat, a reservation waiting at Le Marie, the French restaurant where I'd proposed all those years ago. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed a black BMW 7 Series parked there. I knew that car. Vanessa had once pointed it out at the country club, saying, "That's Dennis's car, the one with the custom leather interior." At first, I thought he might have stopped by on business. But then I saw the bedroom curtains drawn, in the middle of the afternoon. I stood in the foyer, frozen, roses in my hand, listening to the unmistakable sounds coming from upstairs, laughter, hushed voices, the creak of the floorboards. Not nervous laughter. Not guilty. But familiar laughter, the kind that only comes from routine. I didn't storm in. I didn't scream. I sat in my truck for 3 long hours, staring at the house I'd built, waiting for Dennis to leave. At 6:30 p.m., he finally walked out the front door, adjusting his tie with one hand and kissing my wife with the other, right there on my porch. Vanessa waved to him, standing in the silk robe I'd bought her for Christmas. When I finally went inside, she was humming softly, cooking dinner like nothing had happened. "You're late," she said, without looking up from the stove. "Anniversary or not, you could have called." The divorce papers came the next morning. I was in a staff meeting when a man in a gray suit walked in and handed me an envelope in front of 32 employees. "Brown Warren?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "You've been served." My brother Tommy stood up, ready to throw the guy out, but I stopped him. My hands were steady, too steady, as I opened the envelope that would end my life as I knew it. Vanessa wasn't just filing for divorce. She was accusing me of abandonment, emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and infidelity. Every accusation was a lie, but that didn't matter. Dennis Corbett had crafted a masterpiece of destruction. The first meeting was held in Dennis's office, a calculated move to show who had the upper hand. Vanessa sat beside him in a tailored suit, diamond earrings catching the light, ones I'd never seen before. Dennis leaned forward, smug and calm. "My client has been suffering in silence for years. Mr. Warren, your workaholism, your emotional neglect, your obsession with money, we have documentation." "What documentation?" my lawyer, Paul Redfield, asked. Dennis opened a box filled with files, forged journals, bank statements, photos of me working during family events. Even sworn statements from country club members claiming they'd seen me verbally abuse my wife. "This is fiction," I said, my voice breaking. "Vanessa, tell them. Tell them this isn't true." She finally looked up at me, eyes cold as January. "The only lie," she said softly, "was pretending our marriage meant something." From that moment, I knew I was already defeated. Dennis's cousin, a so-called forensic accountant, testified that I'd hidden offshore accounts and undervalued the business. The judge, Martin Brennan, nodded along to every word Dennis said. I'd voted for that man once, believing he cared about fairness. Now I saw the truth: justice was a game for those who could afford to rig it. Vanessa cried on cue in court, painting me as a cruel tyrant who'd controlled every aspect of her life. Mason and Sophie submitted letters, heartbreaking ones, saying I'd chosen work over family, that I'd been emotionally distant for years. I remember sitting there, trying to breathe, feeling the air leave my lungs with every word. 6 hours later, Judge Brennan's ruling came down like a hammer. Vanessa got the house, the business, the savings, and full custody with maximum support payments based on my old income. I was left with a 20-year-old Honda Civic and the clothes I was wearing. "This is justice," Dennis said loud enough for everyone to hear as we left the courtroom. Then, leaning close to me, he whispered, "She tastes even better when she's free." That night, I packed what little I had and moved into a studio apartment above a restaurant that always smelled of curry and smoke. The empire I'd built was gone. The family I'd fought for, gone. The man I used to be, gone. I thought that was the end of my story. But it was only the beginning. The studio apartment on Belmont Avenue cost $800 a month and came with a view of a brick wall. After 3 months of living there, I knew every stain on the ceiling, every rattle in the heater, and every hour the upstairs baby cried. My meals were a rotation of instant noodles, peanut butter sandwiches, and dollar store soup. But worse than hunger was invisibility, that quiet humiliation of being forgotten. Old employees crossed the street when they saw me. Country club acquaintances suddenly had urgent calls. Even my brother Tommy kept his distance, still working for the company, now under Vanessa's control. One night, we met secretly at a rest stop off the interstate. "She's watching everything," Tommy whispered. "Dennis has her paranoid. If she finds out I'm here, I'm done." I just nodded. I understood. My bank account balance read $1,043. Most of it was eaten by court-ordered payments based on an income one no longer had. The judge had refused to adjust anything. Mason wouldn't speak to me, and Sophie only called once, crying, to tell me Mom had proof of my affairs. Fake documents. Fake accounts. Fake everything. I was a ghost of the man I'd once been. Then came that Thursday evening. I was cleaning out my storage unit, the one Vanessa never knew about, sorting through my father's old tools, photos, and junk I couldn't bring myself to throw away. In a worn shoebox labeled important papers, I found something that made my heart stop. A savings passbook from First National Trust, dated January 15, 1960. Name, Brown Eugene Warren. Deposit, $50. Paperclip to it was a note in my grandfather's steady handwriting. "For my grandson's future. Do not touch except in dire need. Eugene Warren." I remembered hearing about it once as a kid, a small account he'd opened the day I was born. We all assumed it had vanished in one of the many bank mergers over the years. Still, something in me, maybe pride, maybe desperation, told me to check. My grandfather was a simple man. He'd worked at the Chrysler plant for 4 decades, came home every night smelling like oil and iron. I still remembered how his hands looked, tough, scarred, but gentle when he'd slip $1 into my palm. "Save half, spend half," he used to say. "Time makes money grow, Brown. Remember that." The next morning, I ironed my last decent shirt, the one I used for job interviews, and drove to the Chase branch that now stood where First National Trust used to be. The teller, a young woman named Patricia, smiled politely. "How can I help you today, sir?" "I'd like to close an old savings account," I said, sliding the yellowed passbook across the counter. "Very old. 1960. Her brow furrowed. She typed something, frowned, typed again. "Let me check our archive system, one moment please." I figured she'd come back and tell me the account had long since been closed or turned over to the state. Instead, she returned with the branch manager, a silver-haired man named Theodore Grayson. His expression was calm, but his eyes said otherwise. "Mr. Warren," he said softly, "could you step into my office? There's something about this account we need to discuss privately." My stomach dropped. I followed him down the hall, watching his hands tremble slightly as he carried my grandfather's passbook like a sacred relic. Inside his mahogany-lined office, Theodore sat down, entered a series of commands, and then froze, staring at his monitor as if it had just spoken to him. "Mr. Warren," he began, then cleared his throat. "What you have here is something quite extraordinary." He explained that back in 1960, First National Trust had offered a rare investment instrument, the Century Growth Account, locked at 7.5% annual compound interest, untouchable for 45 years. "Your grandfather chose that plan," Theodore said. "And every bank merger since then had to legally honor its terms." He turned the screen toward me. And there it was, a number that looked like a mistake, too large, too impossible to be real. $4,847,539.28. I stared at it, counted the digits, and whispered, "That's not possible." It started with $50. Theodore smiled faintly. $50 at 7.5% compound interest for 64 years, Mr. Warren. Your grandfather made a very wise choice. He showed me a graph, the steady growth for decades, and then, in the last 20 years, an explosion upward. I sat frozen, trembling. This is mine? All yours, he said. And there's more. He pulled an old file from his cabinet, a folder yellowed with time. Your grandfather also instructed us to purchase $100 worth of stock in a small textile company called Berkshire Hathaway in 1965. My breath caught. Berkshire Hathaway? You mean? Yes, Theodore nodded. The very same company Warren Buffett built. He did the math quietly on a notepad. Those shares are now worth about $8.2 million. I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Theodore slid a sealed envelope toward me, my name written on it in fading ink. Your grandfather left this to be opened when you claimed the account, he said. With trembling hands, I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Dear Brown, if you're reading this, you've reached the age of wisdom, and perhaps, the edge of despair. I know nothing of your future, only that life brings storms. I worked my whole life with my hands, not my head, but I learned 3 truths. Money isn't wealth, time is. What's hidden can't be stolen. A man who seems to have nothing is often the richest man in the room. I met a young man named Warren once, said patience was the key to all fortune. Maybe this account becomes nothing. Maybe it becomes everything. Use it wisely. Trust sparingly. Love cautiously. Your grandfather, Eugene Warren. P.S. Never show all your cards. When I looked up, tears blurred my vision. Theodore's voice broke the silence. If your ex-wife had known about this account, she could have ruined it. Any attempt to access it before your 45th birthday would have erased all interest and gains. Her greed actually protected you. The irony hit me like divine justice. Vanessa and Dennis had thought they'd taken everything. But they had no idea I was holding something timeless, a lifeline born decades before I'd even existed. As I walked out of that bank, sunlight spilling through the glass doors, I realized my grandfather hadn't just left me money. He'd left me power. Quiet, patient, unshakable power. I walked out of that bank a different man than the one who'd walked in. Not just because of the money, but because I finally understood what my grandfather had meant. Real power isn't what you show. It's what you keep hidden until the moment is right. For the next 2 weeks, I told no one. I kept living in that tiny apartment, eating ramen, working warehouse shifts, letting everyone think I was still broken. But quietly, I began meeting with a man named Arthur Blackstone, one of New York's most feared attorneys. Ironically, he'd once been Dennis Corbett's mentor. Dennis was brilliant, Arthur told me, leaning back in his chair during our first meeting in his penthouse office. Brilliant, ruthless, and completely without ethics. I've been waiting a long time to teach him what consequences look like. Arthur didn't disappoint. His investigation unearthed everything, the fraud, the corruption, the lies. Dennis and Judge Brennan weren't just golf buddies, they were partners in a racket that swapped favorable rulings for kickbacks. The forensic accountant who'd testified against me wasn't even licensed. He was Dennis's cousin, fabricating evidence for cash. And Vanessa? She wasn't just complicit. She'd been one of the architects. Arthur filed fraud, judicial misconduct, and racketeering charges. 3 weeks later, Dennis Corbett was led out of his law office in handcuffs. The FBI seized his accounts and froze all assets connected to him, including Vanessa's. Judge Brennan was arrested the same day. The scandal splashed across every local news station. Prominent divorce attorney and judge arrested in corruption scandal. Vanessa called me that night, her voice sharp with panic. What did you do, Brown? How is this even possible? You had nothing. I waited a long moment before answering. I had nothing, I said quietly. Nothing you could see. Her silence said everything. The court overturned the divorce ruling. Vanessa was ordered to return every asset she'd stolen, the business, the house, the money that wasn't already gone to designer jewelry and plastic surgery. Dennis, desperate to save himself, turned on her, revealing that she'd helped plan the entire scheme. For the first time in years, justice felt real. Mason and Sophie came to see me when the truth came out. They'd been manipulated, fed forged documents and lies. Sophie fell into my arms, sobbing. Dad, we're so sorry. She showed us everything, bank statements, photos, we thought it was real. I hugged her tightly. You're my kids. You were victims too. There's nothing to forgive. 6 months later, I sold Warren Plumbing Supply to Brennan Construction, the very company that had once been my biggest client, for $12 million. Between that sale and my grandfather's account, I had more money than I'd ever imagined. But this time, it didn't own me. I bought a modest 3-bedroom home in a quiet New England town. I didn't want mansions or country clubs. I wanted peace. With part of the money, I created the Eugene Warren Foundation, an organization that teaches working-class families about compound interest, long-term saving, and financial patience. Every month, I stand in front of that small community center, talking to people who remind me of my grandfather, men with calloused hands, women juggling 2 jobs, kids trying to build a future. Time, I tell them, is your greatest asset. Not what you earn, but how long you let it grow. My brother Tommy runs the day-to-day operations now. Together, we've helped hundreds of families start their first investment accounts, giving them what my grandfather gave me, a chance. As for Vanessa, she works as a receptionist at a small dental office now, driving an old Toyota, renting a room in her sister's house. Dennis was disbarred and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. Judge Brennan got 5, losing his pension and reputation. Sometimes I think about calling Vanessa, not out of spite, but to tell her I forgive her. Then I remember my grandfather's last words. Never show all your cards. So instead, I keep his picture on my desk, a black and white photo of him standing outside the Chrysler factory, his shirt sleeves rolled up, grease on his hands, a quiet pride in his eyes. Beside it sits that old, faded passbook, the one that started with $50 and grew into $13 million. When young entrepreneurs come to my foundation, bragging about quick profits and fast wins, I point to that passbook. This man, I tell them, turned $50 into $13 million, not through luck or greed, but through patience, wisdom, and faith in time. Every night before bed, I read his letter again. Never let them see all your cards, Brown. Never. He was right. Because the strongest hand you'll ever play is the one no one knows you're holding. If you enjoyed this story, please like and share it with someone who's ever felt broken or betrayed. And remember, sometimes life's cruelest twists are just patience in disguise. The worst thing that ever happened to me became the best.